He's a moron because he's going to destroy the American Empire. But if he actually wants to destroy the American Empire, then the man is the greatest American president ever, okay? Okay, so we're going to have a fun class today, and we're going to make the argument that, in fact, Donald Trump is a genius. That, in fact, all this chaos is purposeful. That there's actually a plan behind all this, okay? That's the argument I want to make to you today. Okay, so what is the plan? What is going on here? All right, so first thing to notice is that the world gets 20%, okay? 20% of its oil from the Middle East, okay? Primarily going to East Asia. So India gets about 6% of its oil from the Middle East. Japan gets 75% of its oil from the Middle East. So East Asia is heavily dependent on Middle East oil, okay? But as you can see, it also goes to Europe as well, and then also to the United States. All right, so the world is dependent on the GCC oil. If this war continues, if ground forces are used, then all the oil from the Middle East collapses. And JP Morgan has come out and said that by mid-April, the world will run out of oil. Okay? So this is a disaster for the world. But it's just much more than energy needs, okay? So because Iran is constraining movement in the Strait of Hormuz, we're seeing 7 major shortages. Okay, so yes, we know oil and LNG are being stopped. Okay, but actually the problem is much worse because look at phosphate, ammonium, sulfur, urea. This is food production. Okay, primarily used for fertilizers. In other words, if this war persists, not only will countries run out of energy, they'll also run out of food, okay? Also, look at this. Helium and sulfur are used for what? They're used for semiconductors, the production of semiconductors. You use helium and sulfuric acid in the production of semiconductors, which leads to AI, okay? So, in other words, this war in the Middle East, it's impacting everything in the modern economy, okay? If this war continues, the global economy could collapse. But again, we're making the assumption that Donald Trump is a genius, and this is all part of his big plan, okay? So what is his plan? All right, so, okay, we know that there's a lot of oil in the Middle East, okay? But, you know, oil is not as rare as people think it is. There's also a lot of oil in Canada. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, okay? Russia also has a lot of oil. So in other words, if the Strait of Hormuz is closed, if this war in the GCC continues, it doesn't mean the world no longer has oil. All it means is the world is now much more dependent on North America and Russia for oil. And so the global economy now shifts over to North America and to Russia, okay? So in other words, the United States starts a stupid war in the GCC in the Middle East. It can't possibly win, but it still benefits because now the world is much more dependent on North America, okay? Why is Venezuela important? Because America just took over Venezuela in January. Okay, and look, Canada has a lot of oil, and Trump is threatening to take over Canada. Okay, so now let's look at who needs the oil. Well, this map tells you that if you're in the red, you consume more oil than you export. And who are these countries? Well, they're Europe, okay? And they are East Asia, as well as Australia. Okay? So, yes, I understand Donald Trump's an idiot. Yes, I understand that he's going to lose this war in the Middle East. Yes, I understand he's going to destroy the global economy. But for some strange reason, he benefits. And the United States benefits. Because now, Europe and China, Japan, Australia, they're much more dependent on North America for resources, for food, for energy. Okay? All right, food. Okay, so nitrogen is important for fertilizers. Okay, you need nitrogen for fertilizers. And as you can, and what this map tells you is that if you are in the blue or the light blue, it means you produce more nitrogen than you need, so you export it. If you are not in the blue, then you're kind of screwed. Okay, so basically, this area especially, this area, okay? Europe, as some parts of Europe, okay? So now they need more nitrogen. And again, before they were getting a lot of nitrogen, ammonia, from the Middle East. And now, where are they forced to get the nitrogen? From here and from here. Okay? So again, yes, I know Donald Trump's losing this war in the Middle East, but in the long term, America stands to benefit. Right. Last thing I want to look at is water. Okay? Water is important because water tells us which areas are the most stable. Basically, if you have a lot of water, you're less prone to conflict. But if you don't have that much water, then you're prone to conflict, okay? So we look at, so if you're in a dark blue, you're good, okay? Nothing to worry about. If you are in the light blue, you are in a lot of trouble, okay? So if we look at this area, North America, pretty stable because lots and lots of fresh water, okay? If you look at Russia, pretty stable, lots and lots of fresh water. But if you're Africa, you're in a lot of trouble. If you're Europe, you're in a lot of trouble. If you are Middle East, you're in a lot of trouble. If you are Southeast Asia, you are not in that much trouble, but you are in some trouble, okay? So we already see how this map tells us where in the future, basically Russia and the United States, North America, are the most stable parts of the world with the most resources. And therefore, they are the most resilient, the most stable, okay? But if you go to Africa, Europe, Middle East, Southeast Asia, these are points of conflict in the world. So we can expect these places to become much more unstable over time. So in other words, all the United States and Russia have to do is maintain stability and then export resources to these places. And guess what? And then they make a lot of money for themselves. Okay? So again, I understand Donald Trump's an idiot. I understand this war in the Middle East is stupid. But from a long-term game theory perspective, the United States wins from this disaster. From a long-term perspective, okay? Now, you look at this map, you think, well, China's pretty good too, right? Like China has a lot of fresh water. The problem with China, though, is this. China sits on a lot of fresh water that Southeast Asia and India depends on, okay? So a lot of water is in the Tibetan Plateau, and it flows downstream into India and in Southeast Asia. If there were a drought, using game theory, we can suspect that China might want to keep the water for itself, right? In which case, Southeast Asia and India would be very angry, okay? So this is a potential flashpoint that we have to watch out for.